of very familiar faces, and I see a lot of new faces. Welcome, one and all. In theory, you've signed up because we sent you an email blast, and you clicked on the link. Also, you may have found out about us through the most recent issue of the PHSC newsletter, which went out earlier this week. Thank you to Katrin, the new editor, and David for the distribution thereof. So, we, the PHSC, are all about the preservation of the history of photography. We like talking about it. We like getting together and chatting and doing events such as this. Follow us, of course, on Instagram. And of course, another good way is through our website, www.phsc.ca, where you can sign up for this very vaunted, very wonderful email newsletter and the blasts that we will send you on a regular basis, letting you know about things like this. You go to the website, give us your email address. We don't sell it. We don't do anything crazy with it. We just keep you informed about events like this and upcoming fairs and events. A couple of things. Next, a photography event that we're involved in is the London Vintage Film Camera Show. That's on Saturday, April the 20th. This event's been going on for a number of years in London, Ontario, down the road here. For the first time, I think ever, it's on a Saturday. So careful when you mark your calendars. Saturday, April the 20th in Westview Baptist Church. It'll be on our website if it isn't already. Shortly thereafter, the following week on the Sunday, the 28th, is the Rival Camera Show at the Japanese Cultural Center. That's April the 28th, which brings us to May. First event in May is the auction on May the 5th, the Sunday, at our usual haunt, the Legion Hall 101. Start time is about, 1:30-ish. Depending on how quickly the church gets out ahead of us. We round that week off, May the 26th, with our fair, Come One, Come All. That's at the Ukrainian Hall in the southwest corner of Toronto. Come One, Come All. Quick reminder, middle of July 14th, will be our outdoor trunk sale. Come to that. Folks, email is a good way of keeping in touch with us, but best just become a member. $35. It's the best deal going. 4 times a year, you get the best journal in the business, produced by our editors who are here tonight. Thank you very much for joining us. And it gives you little deals on table rentals at our fairs and our events, and it kind of gets you in the in crowd. And so do join up. Again, go to the website, membership, $35. Send us some money. We'll sign you up and we'll have a great time. If there's anything else, we'll discuss it at the end. Like I say, welcome one and all. I see people are coming in from just all over the planet. There's great attendance, folks. Welcome, welcome. I'm going to throw it back to Celio, who is our program coordinator, to do all the intros. That's enough out of me. We'll chat afterwards if you have any questions or comments, folks. To you, Celio.
Thank you, Clint. So again, thank you all for coming to our very special program tonight. This is part of our, it's one of the activities in our society's mandate, where we promote and foster the care and the history, the study, the history of photography. And not always has to be linked to Canada. And tonight we have a very special guest. His name is Kjeld Duits, who is a photojournalist who has been based in Japan since 1990.
1982.
1982. Sorry, my bad.
Yeah.
1982. So just a couple of weeks, right? Mm-hmm. And for the past almost 20 years, Mr. Duits has been building a really impressive collection of old Japanese photographs spanning from the Edo period, the Meiji period, and the Taisho era. So roughly from the 1860s to the 1930s. Would that be it
1960.
for 1960s?
Mm.
Okay. All right. So it is our pleasure, live from Tokyo, to present to you Mr. Kjeld Duits. Kjeld, take it away.
Thank you, CDO. And thank you very much for the invitation. I consider it a great honor to speak at the Photographic Historical Society of Canada. I see the slides are not yet on the screen. Shall I wait for that? And there we are. Now, oops, and now I don't see. Just a second. So before I start my actual talk about how Japan became the empire of hand-colored photography, let me give a little background information about how I started my collection and what kind of collection it is. Next, I've lived in Japan since 1982, as I just mentioned. And one thing that has always bothered me is that in most Japanese cities, you feel almost no connection with the past. It's mostly concrete and asphalt, almost no historical buildings, and it's virtually impossible to imagine how people lived here 100 or 200 years ago. And when you go to the center of European cities, where I grew up, the buildings are often hundreds of years old, and you're surrounded by history. Because we stand on the shoulders of the people who came before us, I missed that tremendously. Next, I could find it a little bit in the old quarters of cities like Kyoto and Nara, and I found it in Japan's traditional festivals, like the one you're seeing now on the screen. These festivals are called Matsuri. Matsuri are living history. But mostly I felt lost in the Japanese deserts of asphalt and concrete. Next. This changed on January 1st, 1999. That day, a Japanese English language newspaper published an article about the previous 100 years in Japan. And I saw old photographs of Japan for the very first time. All at once, Japan came alive in a whole new way. It was love at first sight. But at the time, it didn't occur to me at all to collect these images. I automatically assumed that you only found them in museums. Next. 8 years later, on January 3rd, 2007, again New Year, I was doing a traditional New Year's visit at a famous shrine in Kyoto. We have an earthquake here. I cannot turn off my sound. Let's see. We have a fairly big earthquake right here. Yeah, sorry about that, Fox. I think
You just
we're
had an
fine.
earthquake now?
Yeah, we just had a big earthquake.
Are you okay?
No, Fox, that was a big one. Even my cat Fox was a little bit surprised, but we're okay. I'm going to continue. So I was doing a traditional New Year's visit at a famous shrine in Kyoto, the one you can see here on the photo, the Fushimi Inara Taisha. And in a small souvenir store next, I found this booklet, Bakumatsu Ishin Saishiki no Kyoto, Colorful Kyoto during the Bakumatsu and Meiji periods. It was full of incredibly beautiful hand-colored photographs of Kyoto at the end of the 19th century. I had now been exposed to these old photographs 2 times, both during New Year. And during the New Year, one makes resolutions. So I immediately bought the book and decided, still in the store itself, to find out if I could get my hands on the original photographs and build up a private collection. Next, only 5 days later, on January 8th, I bought the very first old photo of my collection, this photo of a greengrocer. By the end of that year, I had purchased almost 1,400 photographs and postcards. I went a little bit overboard. This January, it was exactly 17 years since that first purchase, and my collection now consists of about 10,000 photographs and postcards, and I have an additional 40,000 digital files from other private collections. Next, I now collect not only photographs and postcards, but also old maps. Next, vintage currency. Next, Hiki Fuda advertising posters. Next, ukiyo-e woodblock prints. Next, elementary school textbooks. Next, and postcards designed by Japanese artists. Next, in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, these were wildly popular. And I collect all kinds of other ephemera from everyday life between about 1860 and the 1960s. So I limit myself to the 100 years in which Japan underwent a gigantic transformation from a closed feudal country to a modern nation with one of the largest economies in the world. And this collection basically documents how modern Japan was born out of the traditional society of the Edo period. Now, when you build a collection, next, as you know, you must have a focus. And there are an insane number of possibilities. You can concentrate on a particular technique, a certain genre or movement, a photographer, a group of photographers, and on and on and on. My focus is anthropological and socio-historical. What did Japan look like? What was daily life like? How did the Japanese work? How did they do the laundry? How did people celebrate? These kind of everyday things. I have a set list of about 20 themes or so related to daily life, and I make my acquisitions based on those themes. Next, I've built an online image archive that is free for anybody to access. It's called Meiji Showa, meijishowa.com. And here the images in my collection can be searched according to these themes. The site allows complicated combined searches using these themes and keywords. Say, for example, as on this example, buildings and structures, the theme, in Tokyo, the place, photographed by Kimbe Kusakabe, the artist, in the 1890s, the decade. You can see these categories in the drop-down menus at the top of this page. And you can combine them in any way you like and also add your own keywords. So instead of having to search through thousands and thousands of images, you look at just a handful limited to your specific search needs. It's a very efficient way to quickly find or not find what you're looking for. Next, put together the photographs, art, and maps tell the story of everyday life in a way that each one is unable to do just by itself. And that is my aim, to tell stories. I want to distill the human story from these photographs, prints, and maps and bring that story to life. My collection as a whole is trying to tell a story, the story of the everyday and how that changes over the centuries, how we're connected to each other and to the past and to the future. Next. And I tell that story on my site, my next site, Old Photos of Japan, oldphotosjapan.com. Here I combine the photos and the art and maps with research. And much of the research comes from books and academic studies, but I also do some original research. Now, I've lived in Japan for over 40 years and I've worked as a journalist for almost 3 decades. But every time I research these images, I discover something new. Next, let's go to the topic of today's talk, Empire of Color. We will explore how 19th century Japanese artists mastered the art of hand-colored photography. And this has been mostly forgotten today, but around the late 1800s, Japan was actually world famous for the magical quality of its hand-colored photographs. was a stunning synthesis of modern Western technology and traditional Japanese artisanship. By the way, for the benefit of aesthetics, I have cropped some of the images in this presentation today. Next, some people think that I colored the vintage photos in my collection. They were, of course, tinted by the studios that published them in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Experienced artisans added the color to monochrome albumen prints, stereo views, glass slides, and color type prints. Their work was meticulous and masterful. They used transparent watercolors to keep the important details of each photo visible, and they applied slightly different hues to create shading. When there were rocks in a garden or baskets on a cart, they tried to give each its own individual tone and texture, and very often they did not cover the whole photo with paint. Many only added color where it made a significant difference. And this was actually a practice that ukiyo-e woodblock printers had first explored. This 1900s view of a silk dyeing workshop by Japanese photographer Teijiro Takagi is a great example of such selective coloring. When it was done really well, the result touches the observer more profoundly than modern color photography. Next. In this photo of a village street, it feels like you can touch the dirt on the children's clothing, and the brightly colored foreground attracts the eyes to the action. It's very similar to the way that we naturally look at the world. The print has an almost three-dimensional depth, and that's accomplished largely by how the color was applied. It took Japanese photographers several decades to master these skills. Next. As you all know, practical photography started when French artist Louis Daguerre announced his invention of the daguerreotype in 1839. The French government purchased the rights and offered the process as a free gift to the world. And it also published Daguerre's complete working instructions in 8 languages. Next. But at the time, Japan was still limiting contact with the outside world. No travel abroad was allowed, trade was severely limited, and Japan's borders were closed to most foreigners. And this made it extremely difficult for Japanese people interested in this new technology to acquire the required equipment, chemicals, and technical skills. The equipment alone was a huge hurdle. The cover of this 1847 book about the daguerreotypes shows the massive amount of equipment required. Next. So it took a while until cameras arrived in Japan. They had to be brought in through the exclusive Dutch trading post on Nagasaki's Dejima Island, which you can see on this photograph. The Dutch were the only Westerners allowed to enter and trade in Japan. By 1855, at least 5 cameras had reached Japan through this route. Next. In 1849, one of them was sold to Shimazu Nari Akira, and he was the future daimyo, a provincial lord of the Satsuma domain. And that's a province, or that was a province, in the very south of Japan, about 140 kilometers away from Nagasaki. On this Dutch map from 1860, number 1 is Nagasaki, number 2 is Satsuma, and number 3 is Tokyo. At the time it was still called Edo, usually spelled with a Y in front, but this is a Dutch map, and so they spelled it with a J. Shimazu was fascinated by Western science and technology, so he appointed some of his retainers to experiment with the camera. Next. It took them until late 1857 before they finally managed to create a discernible image. 8 years after the purchase and 18 years after Daguerre's announcement. Next. This photograph Oh, sorry, it was not next yet. Can we go back? This photograph, a portrait of Shimazu in formal attire, is now held at Kagoshima's Shoko Shuseikan Museum, and it's considered to be the oldest daguerreotype taken in Japan by a Japanese. This struggle to capture an image reveals that a crucial ingredient was missing: knowledge on how to use the equipment. Next. And 3 people helped remedy this: 2 Dutch doctors posted to Dejima and a Swiss photographer traveling around Asia. On August 2nd, 1853, Dutch doctor Jan Karel van den Broek landed at Dejima. And he had been employed by the government of the Dutch East Indies to function as the physician of the Dutch trading post. He arrived at a unique time. Many Japanese intellectuals felt that Japan had to catch up with the Western powers, which were seen as a threat to Japan's sovereignty. And there was an insatiable hunger for knowledge of advanced Western science. Van den Broek became the go-to person to answer questions on subjects ranging from chemistry to gunnery. And he was prepared for that. His office featured an electrical generator, an electric battery, a working telegraph, a microscope, a telescope, and even a wooden model of a steam engine. What he had been unable to bring with him, he created. His influence on Japan's modernization was significant. In 1856, he received an astonishing 5,000 Japanese visitors. His advice led to the construction of several factories and foundries, and the first steam engine constructed by Japanese was based on his instructions. In 1854, Van den Broek sent the Dutch government a secret letter requesting more than 60 Western instruments, models, and tools. And the second item on this list was a daguerreotype camera and accessories. He had also brought his own camera, so he had at least 2 cameras. A letter from July 1856 states that he was successfully using one or both of these cameras and was about to start teaching photography to Japanese students. He was replaced by JLC Pompe van Meerdervoort, another Dutch doctor, who continued his photography lessons. His students included Hikoma Ueno, one of the first professional Japanese photographers, and Koichi Uchida, who in 1872 became the first person to officially photograph a Japanese emperor and empress. Next. The next important step in Japan's mastery of photography was the arrival of the Swiss photographer Pierre-Joseph Rocher. He was commissioned by the London-based firm Negretti and Zambra to shoot a set of the newly opened country. Rocher arrived in Japan in June 1859. He helped the photography students in Nagasaki overcome the last remaining obstacles, and he even sold some of them lenses, chemicals, and albumin paper. This instruction and the opening of Yokohama and Nagasaki to international trade was the tipping point. From that moment on, exactly 20 years after Daguerre's announcement, photography started to spread throughout Japan. This 1859 view of Kanagawa by Rocher is one of the first commercially sold photographs of Japan, and the road in the center is the famous Tokaido Highway. Next, in an 1877 letter to the British Journal of Photography, Samuel Cocking, a British merchant in Yokohama who imported photographic supplies, noted that Tokyo already counted 240 photographers, 240, with an equal substantial number of photographers in nearly every town throughout the interior, he wrote. These photographers mainly serviced the domestic market for portrait photos, but there was another important market. Visitors from the United States, Canada, and Europe, desiring memories of their once-in-a-lifetime tour to faraway Japan. And although this market was much smaller, it was incredibly lucrative. Many of these visitors had very deep pockets. As Japan had just opened its borders after more than 2 centuries of seclusion, it was seen as exotic and mysterious, and Western visitors wanted to share that experience with friends and family, and photos were perfect for that. So hand coloring developed in this market of souvenir photos, and most of the photographers offering hand-colored souvenir photos were based in the port city of Yokohama, which was opened to foreign traders in 1859. That's why these colored photographs are often called Yokohama Shashin, Yokohama photographs. Next, as soon as photography was invented, color was a concern and expectation. British scientist Robert Hunt covered the issue of color in an article published in 1841, only 2 years after Daguerre's announcement. And the following decades, there were lots of articles like this one that you see here from 1864 in the Philadelphia publication, The Camera and the Pencil. Practical color reproduction, however, turned out to be extremely difficult. So photographers ended up hand coloring their images. Next, the very first known reference to a hand-colored photograph of Japan is an 1860 ad in the Times by Negretti and Zembra for a stereo view taken by Swiss photographer Rocher. It was a colored version of this stereo view of 2 Japanese women, probably photographed in 1859. Unfortunately, I have not yet found a colored version of this image. Next. In spite of this early colored stereo view, it took a long time before coloring photographs took off in Japan. It only happened after the arrival of Italian-British photographer Felice Beato in 1863. And he seems to have started coloring his prints on a large scale in the mid to late 1860s. Beato at the time was already famous as a pioneering war photographer. He covered the Crimean War, the Indian Rebellion, and the Second Opium War in China. And then he came to Japan in 1863. Next, Beato had an enormous influence on Japanese photography aimed at the international market. In 1868, he was the first one to sell photographic souvenir albums in Japan, and these soon became a staple product. The topics and themes that he chose, and even the photographs themselves, were used for decades by photographers who came after him. And his work was also used as the basis for engraved illustrations of Japan in Western newspapers, magazines, and books. For example, Swiss envoy Aimé Humbert used over 100 Beato images for his celebrated work, Le Japon Illustré, Japan and the Japanese Illustrated. Next, here is a photo of Kanagawa on the Tokaido Road between Edo and Kyoto, taken by Beato in the 1860s. Next, and here is an engraving based on the photo. This one was published in The Earth and Its Inhabitants in 1895, some 3 decades after the photo was shot. Amazingly, Beato's photographs were used well into the 20th century. So it's no exaggeration to say that the popular image of traditional Japan was shaped by Beato. Next, Beato divided his photographs into topographical views and portraits. The portraits were often occupational views staged in the studio, like this one. And these views were referred to as costumes at the time. While the topographical views were usually left untinted, The costumes were almost always hand-colored, and it's believed that this coloring was initially done by Beato's business partner, the British artist Charles Workman. Soon after, though, Japanese artists were hired to perform this task. Next, by 1872, Beato employed 4 Japanese colorists, and one of them was the artist Kimbe Kusakabe, who started to work for Beato in the late 1860s. Later, Kimbe became a successful photographer in his own right. In 1987, the Japanese photo researcher Yoichi Kuwajima found this photo of a colorist in the Beato studio, and this is believed to be Kimbe. Japanese colorists have generally remained anonymous and faceless, so this was an astounding discovery. Next, the coloring techniques pioneered by Beato were adopted by all other photographers catering to the international market, and especially influential was the Austrian photographer Baron Raymond von Stilfried's Ratenitz, better known as just Stilfried. He is on the right in this photo, and the person on the left is again believed to be Kimbe. Stilfried was mentored by Beato, and he started his own studio in 1871. In 1877, his studio burned down, and he purchased Beato's studio and inventory. Next, Stilfried continued and expanded on Beato's themes and subjects, and also Beato's custom of creating photographic albums separated into sections of untinted topographical views and hand-colored costumes, but he created his own style by applying the principles then dominating the European fine arts. It's believed that Stilfried hired Kimbe as well as other Japanese colorists and assistants. At the studio speak, he employed 39 Japanese assistants. Many of these assistants later opened their own photography studios. Some of them, like Kimbe and Shuzaburo Usui, also created hand-colored photographs for the tourist market, so they effectively became Stilfried's competitors. Next, from the second half of the 1870s, Japanese studios slowly started to encroach on the hand-colored photo market that had been dominated by Beato and Stilfried. Next, the first one to do so was Usui. He first advertised his studio in 1875. Soon he was so well known that when US President Ulysses S. Grant visited Japan in 1879, only some 4 years after the studio opened, he had himself photographed at the Usui studio. At the time, Grant was the most famous American in the world, so he would not have visited just any studio. Next, Kimbe started his business sometime between 1878 and 1880, and as you can see here, Kimbe was actually his first name. Foreign customers found his family name, Kusakabe, too difficult to say and remember, so he advertised under Kimbe. Next, Usui and Kimbe were not the only ones to open studios. In 1883, Kozaburo Tamamura opened his Yokohama studio, and he would become the commercially most successful Japanese photographer of the 19th century. We have a few more people. Next, Kazumasa Ogawa. He pioneered photomechanical printing in Japan and opened a studio in Tokyo in 1885. And his gorgeous colored color types of flowers still impress today. Next, in the same year as Ogawa, the Italian photographer Adolfo Vasari bought up the studio originally started by Stilfried. Vasari located himself next to the famed Grand Hotel in Yokohama, conveniently close to his foreign clientele. He was a natural genius at marketing. Next, Nobukuni Enami. He established his studio in 1892, just a stone's throw from top earner Tamamura. Enami was one of the most accomplished photographers of the era. He was not only a master in prints, but also in magic lantern slides, like this one, and stereo views. His work feels very real and intimate. He looked through his lens like a journalist. Next, one more major player jumped into the fray. In 1904, Teijiro Takagi, we already encountered his name, took over Tamamura's Kobe branch. And Takagi published gorgeous hand-colored lantern slides and color type books based on specific themes, for example, about Japanese weddings or how Japanese houses were built. This color type of a bride is from one such book. Like the other color photographers, Takagi was also very much geared towards the foreign market. Next, so we're back at this timeline. The studios on this timeline are the most influential ones for hand-colored photography in Japan. But countless other studios were started during the same period. Most, however, quickly failed. And it was this intense competition, especially in the 1880s, 1890s, that transformed hand coloring into a crucial competitive tool. Next, Usui Studio was one of the first to also color topographical views. This colored view of Kobe is from his studio. Other studios followed, and by the 1880s, colored views had become the norm in Japan. Next, this competition over color can actually be seen in advertising. Color is still rarely mentioned in ads during the 1880s, but from around 1890, it becomes standard. This ad for the Kimbei studio in Keeling's Guide to Japan, published in 1890, is an early and still rather understated example. It specifically mentions the studio's specialty of artistically coloring topographical views of Japan. Western visitors were surprised and delighted by this coloring. When Scottish engineer and photographer William Kinnaman Burton was hired by the Japanese government to lecture at Tokyo Imperial University in 1887, he shared his impressions in a letter to the British Journal of Photography. Next, and he wrote that although coloring landscape photographs was frowned upon in Great Britain, it was a much more excusable practice in Japan. One reason, wrote Burton, was that light in Japan was very different from light in Great Britain. Color, he wrote, is of importance enough at home, but it is of very much greater importance here, where its vividness is something that is impossible to describe. He added that coloring photographs was probably looked down upon in Great Britain because it was done badly, and not because there was something essentially vicious, his words, in a colored photograph. The Japanese, he wrote, were well known to be most skillful in the use of colors. Next. Now, surprisingly, little is known about the colorists, how they worked, who they were, what kind of a background they had, or even how many there were. Anecdotal information suggests that there may have been many hundreds. Next, in 1896, Boston-based publisher J.B. Millett imported over 400,000 hand-colored photographs from Japan to tip into the multi-volume Japan Described and Illustrated by the Japanese, the series of books that you see in this photo. And according to the publishers, more than 350 Japanese artists were engaged in this project, 350, and likely many of them were colorists. Next, in the late 1880s, Italian photographer Vasari wrote his sister that he employed 40 people, and 16 of these were colorists. He explained that he first made sure that an applicant could paint Japanese style, and he then trained the person for 2 to 4 months. Coloring was very precise and very time-consuming work. When Scottish engineer and photographer Burton visited Vasari's studio, he was told that the colorists took several hours to color a single photograph. And Vasari told him that he was satisfied if each artist colored 2 or 3 prints a day. A Yokohama court case from 1878 suggests that in some cases coloring took even longer, much longer. Stillfried, who appeared as an expert witness in this case, stated that the coloring of the 2 photos presented in the case would occupy the skilled workman 20 days. But it seems that mass production was more common, especially during the fierce competition of the 1880s and 1890s. Some sources claim that Tamamura, who competed mostly on price, had his colorists tint over 60 images a day. Now, this sounds extreme, but Vasari wrote his sister that one of his Japanese competitors actually worked this way. Vasari's advertising actually stressed the unreliable quality of other studios. An 1893 ad claimed that his studio had the only photographers that deliver pictures equally as well painted as those exhibited in our sample albums or frames. Next. However, as the following images will illustrate, Kimbe and later photographers like Inami and Takagi also produced extremely impressive coloring. This is a photo of the Kameido Tenjin Shrine in Tokyo by Kimbe. It's a hand-colored albumen print from the 1890s. Next. This shows 2 Japanese women with paper parasols at Togetsuko Bridge in Arashiyama, Kyoto, by Teijiro Takagi. It's a hand-colored glass slide from the 1910s. Also exquisite coloring. Next. And these 3 children admiring the fish of a Japanese goldfish vendor was photographed by Nobokuni Enami. It's a hand-colored glass slide from the 1910s. Again, the color is exquisite. We know very little about the coloring process itself. As far as I've been able to ascertain, no laboratory research has been done on the materials used, and no memoir or letters by Japanese colorists are known that explain how they worked. It's believed that water-soluble vegetable pigments as well as synthetic colors were used. These offered greater transparency than the oil paints that were generally used in Western countries. Next. If you put a colorized European photograph, like this one, next to a Japanese one, you see the difference immediately. In Japanese photographs, the colors are soft, transparent, and realistic. The color is not on top of the photograph. Can we go back? Yes. But go back to the Western photograph. Yes, thank you. But it has become, the color has become part of the photograph in Japanese photographs. This 1860 photo of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert by John Jabez Edwin Mayle very clearly shows the difference. The paint is on top of the photographs. It's a painting. Next, Japanese colorists sat on the floor at low tables. The colors were mixed with water in small porcelain saucers, one for each color used in the print. Some studios may have used production lines in which each colorist applied specific colors and then passed the print to the next colorist. This is a Japanese colorist at work around 1865, 1875. Some researchers believe that this is Kimbe at work in the Beato studio. Notice the large number of color dishes. He has 9 of them. Next. In this photo of colorists at work around 1885, 1895, so later than the previous photo, the colorist on the right appears to have at least 12 sources on his table. Also notice that the colorists in this photo have clipped the prints onto boards. Albumen prints used extremely thin paper that very easily curl. Next. The working method in these photos is basically identical to the way Japanese artists traditionally worked. This photo from the 1880s shows a female artist painting a screen. She also has a large number of the same kind of small dishes, and she also sits on the floor. Incidentally, foreigners were really surprised that Japanese artists sat on the floor. The Western image of an artist was that of a person standing in front of an easel. Next. We know from one of Vasari's letters that the coloring started with applying water to make the paper damp. And after that, the colors were applied. Although the albumen prints are shiny, no varnish was used. A wide range of brushes were used for the coloring. The finest brush could have just a single strand of hair, and detailed work would require a magnifying glass. This was especially necessary for glass lantern slides and stereo views. Some of the colored details on such media were a millimeter in width or even less. This is an 1890s glass slide by Anami of To Maiko, apprentice geisha. The woman on the right is wearing an obi, a large decorative belt. This one has a crane design. Next. Now notice the gradation in color of the obi. Very carefully darkens from top to bottom and left to right. On the original glass slide, the whole obi measures only about 1 centimeter in width, 1 centimeter. Next. Some images required the coloring of lots of tiny details, like in this photo of a footwear shop from the Inami studio. Notice the cloth straps of the footwear. They are colored in a variety of colors. Let's have a look at the detail next. On the original glass slide, these cloth straps are less than 1 millimeter wide, less than 1 millimeter. In this enlargement, you can clearly see that the artist didn't always hit the target perfectly, but considering that the strap is less than 1 millimeter wide and the artist used a brush, this is amazing work. Next, customers selected the hand-colored photographs from framed samples, display albums, or printed catalogs with numbered photo titles, like the ones that you see here. These were mostly tourists, so they usually made their selection before they started out on their tour through Japan, and they later picked up the albums just before they returned to their country. They picked images of the places that they were going to visit. So studio catalogs were therefore organized by location. On the left are pages from the catalog of the Kimbei studio from around 1893. These pages are for Kobe, Osaka, Lake Biwa, and Nara. These are all areas located close to each other in West Japan, so that's why they're all put together in the same section. On the right are pages from a Takagi catalog from the 1910s. These are images for Tokyo. By the way, this is the Dutch spelling with an I instead of a Y. Next, prints were sold individually or mounted in albums of 50 or 100 photos. The most exclusive of these albums featured magnificent lacquered covers, often inlaid with rich ivory, and occasionally even gold leaf was applied. Vasari exclusively contracted a craftsman to create his studio's lacquered covers. The most common print size in these albums was 8 by 10 inches, so about 20 by 25 centimeters. This is the lacquered cover of a late 19th century Japanese photo album. As you can see, it's beautiful. Next, this photo shows the storefront of the Kimbei studio at number 7 Honcho in Yokohama. The studio moved to this location in 1889. Now, light is the lifeblood of the photographer. So the Kimbei studio had lots of glass windows. Glass windows, or I should say glass, was not made in Japan. until around 1903. So all these glass windows that you see in this photo were imported. So we don't know for sure, but the glass windows likely cost more than the building itself. Selling souvenir photographs must have been a very lucrative business. Next. Because the photographs were hand-colored, we need to answer an important question. How accurate were these colors? Are they a true representation of the scene that the photographer saw? According to research by Australian photo historian Luke Gartland, still freeze colorists followed a strict prototype to ensure uniform production standards. An 1893 ad for the Vasari studio specifically states that the colors were carefully noted at the time that the photos were taken. But even if all studios followed such strict procedures, and the Vasari ad claims that this was not the case, photographs from one studio regularly ended up in the hands of other studios. Stillfried, Vasari, Kimbe, and other studios all sold Beato prints, for example. So by necessity, they would have had to apply their own color scheme. Next. And one actually sees variations in the colors used for a particular photograph, even if produced by the same studio. These differences can be quite pronounced, but usually they're rather subtle. Let's have a look at this example. Here are two lantern slides and a stereo view from the same negative by Nobokuni Inami. His trade name was T. Inami. Even when each image is colored only slightly differently, as in this example, the overall effect results in a different impression. In this case, the stereo view is brighter and feels slightly more cheerful than the glass slides. Next, the colors of some of the clothing differs per image. I have put a mark so you can see it more easily. So we do not know the true colors of the girls' clothing. But anyone familiar with clothing from this period will recognize that the colors are true to the era. The different greens of the bushes, which you can see in the background, are also all possible depending on the season, weather, and time of day. Next, are the colors a true representation of the scene? No. Different images show different colors. Are they a true representation of Japan at that specific time period? Yes. The colors in the photographs generally were the colors of Japan at the time the scenes were photographed. One could perhaps call this selective authenticity. The colors may not perfectly represent the scene, but they do represent the reality of that period. A contemporary and reliable witness actually acknowledged this in his writing. You're probably familiar with British author Rudyard Kipling. He wrote The Jungle Book, made famous by Disney. He wrote that he laughed at the red and blue colors of the hills in Vasari's photographs until he visited the hills. And then he wrote, I saw he had painted true. Next, we tend to think of photographs as identical copies, but each hand-colored photo is really an original, literally and figuratively touched by several artists. The colors they applied are unlikely to correspond perfectly to what the photographer saw. Yet when the coloring was done well, it is in effect an authentic representation of the color scene in Japan at the time the photographs were taken. This was no monkey business. Next, photography was practiced across the globe, and skilled artists existed everywhere. So why did hand coloring reach such exquisite levels in Japan, and why have so many of these photographs survived? Basically, all the right pieces of the puzzle fell together at the right time. Photography was invented just before Japan opened its borders after more than 2 centuries of self-imposed isolation. Photography was announced in 1839, and Japan opened its borders exactly 2 decades later in 1859. Next, And the opening caused a sensation in Western nations. Over the following decades, an ever-increasing number of Japanese goods appeared on the shelves of European and American and Canadian shops, and galleries were filled with Japanese woodblock prints and other artworks. There were special exhibitions and even recreated Japanese villages. In this engraving of the Japanese village exhibition in London, held from 1885 through 87, British men and women are eagerly observing skilled Japanese artisans at work. This wave of Japanese imports influenced exciting new movements in the arts and architecture. Japan was ultra cool. Next. But it was also very far away and incredibly hard and costly to reach from Western countries. Right after Japan opened its borders, a cascade of technological innovations changed this dramatically. Only a decade after Japan opened its borders, telegraphy, steamships, and trains completely transformed global travel and trade. Suddenly, Japan was within reach. When Japan opened its borders in 1859, it took over 4 months to exchange letters with Britain. 4 months, and Britain was then the commercial center of the world. After Japan was linked to the global telegraphy network in 1870, responses could be received within hours. The impact of steamships and trains and the opening of the Suez Canal and the Trans-American Railroad in 1869 was just as great. Travel time between Japan and the West was reduced from many months to just several weeks. So instead of a visit to Japan, meaning that you were away for several years, you could now go and stay away for just a few months. Next. Simultaneously, British power was at its peak. With Great Britain acting as the global policeman, international travel was safer than it had ever been. In 1872, British travel entrepreneur Thomas Cook led the first ever package tour around the globe. So the age of the globetrotter had begun. For the first time in history, large numbers of tourists started traveling around the world. Next, and Japan was on the top of their list. Everybody wanted to see this entrancing fairy tale land, and they all wanted memorable souvenirs. When Beato first started out in Yokohama in 1863, his customers were mainly foreign residents, merchants, missionaries, military officers, diplomats. The ever-increasing number of globetrotters that started to visit Japan from the 1870s opened up a completely new and exceptionally lucrative photography market. Studio portraits in Japanese clothing, like the one you see here, and from the Vasari studio, and especially lavish albums with souvenir photos. Next. These albums did not only function as souvenirs, but also as gifts between international associates. There were upscale corporate gifts inscribed with dedications. Business was not limited to Japan. People who could not afford to travel to Japan were just as fascinated by the country. So a thriving export market of Japanese photography developed. The same steamboats and trains that brought the globetrotters made it possible to transport the photographs relatively quickly and affordably from Japan to markets on the other side of the world. And the result was an intensely enterprising and competitive photographic industry catering to a seemingly insatiable global market. It allowed hundreds of traditionally trained Japanese artists to develop their photo coloring skills to heights unequaled in any other country. Next. This professional souvenir photography market reached its peak during the 1890s, and then it started to collapse. One cause was Eastman Kodak's popular compact and portable film camera, which allowed visitors to take their own photos. Next. Another was new printing technology that gave birth to mass-produced low-cost postcards, like this one from the 1910s. At first, these were also hand-colored, but in the 1920s, color increasingly vanished. Black and white photographs and postcards became the norm, and the age of hand-colored photography came to an end. The once so popular Yokohama studios disappeared forever. Next. Today, more than a century later, large numbers of these beautifully hand-colored photographs still pop up in auctions. While countless numbers of photos in Japan itself were destroyed by earthquakes, fires, war, or the humid climate, the souvenir photographs survived. And they survived precisely because they were souvenirs. They were taken abroad and preserved as valuable personal memories in well-protected, sturdy, and often expensive albums that were cherished and cared for. And that ends my talk. Now, you can revisit this talk on my site, Old Photos of Japan. And there are 4 essays there named Empire of Color, 1, 2, 3, 4. They feature the notes and citations of most of the sources, also additional quotes, as well as the timelines and a list of the photographers that I introduced. I believe there's some questions, so thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to hearing the questions now.
Well, thank you very much, Kjeld, for that incredible presentation.
Wow.
Thank you.
All right. And yes, we would like to open up the floor now for questions. Feel free to use either the chat box or ask your question using your microphone and camera here on the
Salio,
presentation. Yes, sir.
I think there's one or two in chat already queued up. Could you?
Yes, there is. Now, user Vishata asks, did the Japanese photo color movement influence photography in China?
That's a good question. I don't really know if it did or not. You do, of course, see a lot of color photography of China, and a lot of that was actually done by some Japanese photographers as well. But I'm afraid I don't know enough about the photography history in China, so I cannot really answer that question. Sorry about that. My specialty is Japanese photography.
Okay, we have a question by Erwin Reichstein. Go ahead, please, Erwin.
I'm just wondering, the ones I've seen, the photographs that I've seen, almost none of them are signed. And yet there are all these photographers out there. How do you know who did what? I mean, you seem very confident about describing them to one photographer or another. How do you know which photographer did what?
This is actually a big problem in Japanese photography. Very often we don't know. Most of the photographs are almost impossible to attribute, and we're still learning a lot. Many of the attributions we know now have only been discovered in the past few decades. Terry Bennett, a researcher based in the UK, wrote a very beautiful book with an index where that was kind of the first book where a lot of photographs were attributed for the first time. One thing he did was make a list of all the titled and numbered, of all the numbered titles that I also just showed in the catalog. Because the numbered title is on the photo, if you have one of these catalogs, it is usually possible to say, okay, this was sold by this photographer or by this studio, but it doesn't mean that that photographer actually took that photograph. For example, the catalog of Beato has a lot of photos that were taken by Stilfried and Beato. In Kimbei's catalog, there are a lot of photographs that were taken by Beato and Stilfried. So this is actually a very big problem. They stole each other's photos and they didn't sign them. And even when the photos are in their own catalogs, they are not necessarily photographed by them. So when I say by Kimbe or by Enami, I usually only say that for photos where I am very, very, very sure that they are taken by them, or when it is in their catalog. But in that case, it might have been taken by somebody else.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I think your description of the photographs as largely translatable, I suppose, in our terms, as documentary. And but I also noted, as you did, the exquisite delicacy of some of the colors and how powerful some of the images are, which seem to transcend the category.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if there was something like an art movement in Japan which valued these things particularly, and if there were publications and or exhibitions.
These photographs were mostly targeted to the foreign market, to foreign tourists. So colored photographs in Japan themselves were not that popular, actually. Most of the photographs the Japanese people bought themselves were black and white. So when you look at the portraits that Japanese people had taken of themselves at this period, they're almost all black and white. There are very few colored photographs. There were some organizations and publications that catered to photographers. Burton was active in one of those organizations. But then that again was mostly to foreign photographers based in Japan, or foreigners that were based in Japan and teaching here. And there was a Japanese language publication as well, but I don't think that color was picked up that much in that publication. I think that maybe Sirio has studied this in the past.
Yes, and for the most part, the color photographs were meant for the export market. Very, very, very few, if any. Many of these photographers and studios would even take negatives from people living abroad and print them and color them.
Really?
Yeah. So there's some examples of that as well.
So in
But-
short, I think I understand you're saying that there were no communities of people who identified themselves as artists in photography, as happened in all the European and American contexts.
Oh, I see what you mean. No,
Yes.
there were rings of photographers. So, for example, these photographs from Yokohama are today called the School of Yokohama. So, described as a movement with particular aesthetic principles and guidelines, again, serving a commercial market, but with many traits and characteristics in common enough to call it a school or a movement. Of course, later in the 20th century, too, you will see pictorialists, etc., grouping and even native or local groups. But at this time, for the color photographs, I think it's mostly the commercial interests.
And the colorists themselves, though, I don't think they had an organization or got together. Maybe they did. If they did, we don't know. And I also mentioned that in the talk, we know very little about them. We don't really know their names. So the only one that we know about is Kimbe, but only because he became a photographer. And we do know about one more person because he was in the court case that I mentioned. He was a British artist. But otherwise, we don't really know the names of these colorists.
There's another couple of questions here in the chat. Bill asks or says, I had the opportunity to visit Japan for the first time in November and visited the top photo museum where I met with a curator. But in looking through their collection online, I could not find any of these souvenir photographs. Is there interest in these beautiful images in Japan?
Oh, yes and no. I think it's a very small number of people who are interested in this. And the top museum was specifically made to or set up to document the history of photography in Japan, because photography in Japan was ignored for a long time. It was not really seen as an art. And the top museum is still a fairly new museum. It was set up only a few decades ago. So it's still a new development in Japan. People are still studying, still researching. There's still a lot of things we don't know. And I think that most Japanese people have actually never seen these photographs.
Yeah.
And I show my
I
photographs.
also met with someone you probably know, Norahide Takahashi, Professor Takahashi.
Yes, I met him a few weeks ago.
Yeah, and he showed me some things, but nothing like these. It just seems like, the Top Photo Museum has they showed me Japanese amber types, which I was interested in seeing, and showed me just a few of them, and then not having anything to do, as far as I can tell, with Japan. I found they had a complete copy of Life and Landscape on the Norfolk Broads. And I was allowed to see every image from that. But apparently nothing by Beato or Kusakabe Kimbe or any of the greatest hits that you showed.
Well, they actually do have it in their collection.
Just not online. Or
They have some online. Very
I
few.
think they have some online. Yeah. Also, they have a curator. Her name is Miki Mari-san.
Miyoki?
Miki, yes. Miki is
I met with her.
You met her, or?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so what she does, and you probably know this then, is she gives workshops on hand coloring albumin prints.
That I didn't know. Volunteer it.
Yeah, so she has studied this, and she hand colors albumin prints herself, just to understand how they were done in the past. And she also has a Japanese language YouTube clip of her doing that. Let me share the link. Just a sec. Okay, my computer is very slow. This will take a little while.
Earthquakes will do that to it.
Yeah, that was kind of a surprise. I see it was not that big after all. It was a 5.4, which is not that bad. But we had a lot of shaking here for a second time. And my cat never gets upset with earthquakes, but you could hear her meow this time. So I just posted it. This was also a question by somebody else. So hopefully 2 people are excited by this link.
Good. We have 2 more questions. The first by Kyle. Do you also collect photos of the Russo-Japanese War?
Yes, I do, actually. And unfortunately, most of them I have not yet scanned and uploaded, but some have been uploaded. Not only photos, but also engravings. And you can find those on meijishowa.com. Just search for Russo-Japanese War.
We have another question from Melinda, and she asks, so where were there Japanese photographers who only catered to a Japanese audience?
Yeah, almost all photographers in Japan only catered to a Japanese audience. So the ones I just introduced were really exceptions. I mentioned that there was this importer, this British importer in Yokohama of photographic equipment. And he mentioned that around 1870, I think it was, 1870 something, there were already 240 Japanese photographers in Tokyo alone.
Wow.
And those photographers catered only to a Japanese audience. Some of these people didn't have a studio. They just took photographs on the street. They had a tent, and they were basically vendors of photography, just like you have
Mhm.
vendors of food on the street.
So there were more of the Japanese photographers than there were of the people that were catering to the Western market.
Yes, they were an exception, but
Yeah.
it's
And
the hand-colored
Japanese?
photography. Oh, sorry to interrupt you. Let me finish the
No, I'm
sentence. I'll
sorry.
get back to you. The
I-
hand-colored photography was specific for the souvenir photography market. So that's why I
they-
only talked about
Did
these.
it influence the Japanese photographers at all?
Not so much as far as I can discern. They're kind of two separate markets. So you do see some colored photographs in the Japanese market, but the great majority of the photographs are black and white.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
All
I
right.
have a question.
Go ahead, Edwin.
How many copies of each photograph would be colored? Since they're all hand colored, how would they know how many to do or something like that?
I don't know.
Well, I know that for the Japan, what was it? The title of that
Japan, yeah.
encyclopedia?
That's
Japan
500,000.
described by the Japanese. That company ordered over 1 million hand-tinted photographs for all of their various editions.
I think they ordered 1 million photographs, and about I think 500,000 of those were colored.
Yep. Right. And of course, these books also include they have other kinds of artwork inserted in them as well.
Yes.
But as far as I understand, I mean, I can't remember the year now, but Professor Miyawakita posted that in a single year, the value of the export of souvenir photographs only out of Yokohama was about 5 million yen at the time, which today would be quite, I think at the time, I think it was 2 yen for a dollar. So $2.5 million of the 1880s, 1890s per year.
Yeah, so there were millions of photographs sold. Millions. But how many of a single photograph? I don't know.
The other thing I noticed as well is that a lot of the photographs, the background is not colored. So it
Yes.
adds to the 3D effect very much.
Yes, yes, exactly. Yes, it's beautiful, right? So that was kind of originally started by ukiyo woodblock printers, and they basically borrowed that knowledge and that understanding from Japanese artists doing woodblock printing.
And I think it's important to note that in Japanese woodblock printing, you have to create or hand carve a different plate for each of the colors that is in the print. So it's extremely time consuming, right? So that's already in the culture, but a lot of Japanese arts are so time consuming.
Yes.
Your collection just seems such a natural for a museum exhibition. I mean, it would be just a killer. Has that happened, or is it in the works, or to be done?
Museums have used like some photographs. I haven't had a complete exhibition of only photographs in my collection, but quite a few museums have used a few photographs here and a few photographs there. For example, in the Netherlands, there was a very large exhibition about geisha, and they used some scans of photographs of geisha that they have, and they blew it up to cover the whole wall. So these photographs were like 3 meters wide. And there have been museums, I think, in the States, in Austria, in Great Britain. The Victoria and Albert Museum used some of my photographs, but no exhibition yet. This is my hope for the future.
Or a book?
I would really like to open my own museum one day if I do that in the years that I still have left. By the way, I see a lot of photographs and albums in the back there. Is that? Do I see that correctly?
Say what?
Do I see a lot of photographs in the background in your office there?
Oh, yeah, yeah. I'm a photographer and a collector, not of this subject per se, but I
Mhm.
have, as any collector would, have a few examples that just were irresistible. But
Mhm.
but I am a photographer and work on my own books, photo postcards particularly. Have you had books done have you created a book on this, if not the exhibition yet?
Mhm. Not on photography per se. I have written a book about the history of Dutch diplomatic locations in Japan since the 1850s, and that features, of course, a lot of old photographs, including photographs from my own collection. The other books I've published are books of my own photographs. So this still has to come. This is still something that's in the future. Actually, I see my site, Old Photos of Japan, as kind of a draft for a future book.
Ah,
If hopefully one day.
I know the feeling.
We all hope, right? We all hope that we can publish.
Yeah. It's always.
Yes, yeah.
Well, I'm not sure if you're familiar here in Canada. When we think about hand-colored photographs here in North America, we think of two Wallaces. Wallace McCaskill, who operated in the Maritimes, did beautiful things with the ocean and the sea. And in New England, and a tip of our hat to our friends from FSNY who are joining in, is Wallace Nutting. And they both decided in the very late 1800s, early 1900s to go out and photograph in black and white, and then have their black and white photographs hand tinted. And it would be a room of grandmothers, essentially. You know, she'd come in and, hi, I'm green today. And that's what I kind of grew up with. Anybody, as my friend in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, explained to me, anybody living in Nova Scotia or New Brunswick or PEI who didn't have a McCaskill hanging on the wall wasn't a true maritimer, right? That's a not so subtle difference. Those, you know, the people out there embrace these McCaskills, and you know, you go visit grandmother and she'd have, you know, 8 in the washroom alone.
Mhm.
But with both photographers, you presented, you know, something very interesting. Their color was not subtle relative to the beautiful Japanese hand tinting. Their work was like a blow to the forehead with a 2x4. It's yellow, not just a gentle yellow, but a yellow. Like a canary flew into this.
Mhm.
So I will that scan you had of Victoria and Albert, yeah, it's ham-fisted coloring. My goodness,
Yeah.
if it's of any use to you, I'll send you some scans of Nuttings and McCaskills, and you'll just
Oh, that would be wonderful.
you'll
Yeah.
just go like this. So I think, and I'm just saying, you know, if you're presenting to, you know, I know we have our American friends visiting, and certainly lots of Canadian friends, they'll go, McCaskill, ugh, compared to the Japanese, ugh. You know, somebody just sort of taped a brush to their, you know, a painting brush,
Yeah.
and just did their thing. So the subtlety is incredible.
They have, of course, the historical, sorry, the cultural background was, of course, different. The background in Europe and Canada and the United States was oil painting. And here it was woodblock printing and using watercolors. So I think I didn't really mention that in the talk, but of course that made also a big difference in the fact that the hand coloring of photographs was done so well in Japan.
You're absolutely right. In the 1860s, 1870s, Toronto photographers, Ottawa photographers, Montreal photographers, they hand colored their photographs with oil.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
All right. A couple of questions that are here on the chat box, and then we'll go to David. Has Dr. Brian May of Queen been in contact with you regarding your photograph collection? He is very into stereoscopic images and the history of Japan.
No, I don't think so. The name does not sound familiar to me. Sorry about that.
You've heard him.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
All right. And then Vishata says also William England published beautiful hand-colored stereo photo stereos of North America between 1859 and 1860. And Melinda says, thank you so much for this wonderfully informative talk. I've learned so much, and I am very impressed with your collection. Again, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
You've got to be careful, Kjeld. Appearances like this will you will say, "Oh, I have a resource. I know somebody who knows Japanese photography." So, I don't know, hire a secretary or something.
Yeah.
This is
All right.
you know.
David, go ahead.
Hey, I have I have several questions. The first one is about the litigation that you referenced as being revelatory for a lot of these the social history details that you've been sharing with us. And I also echo the sentiments of the other people about what a wonderful talk this has been, and thank you.
Thank you.
So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, the context of that litigation and who the, who the plaintiff and the defendants were, and sort of what the case was about. And then secondly, you mentioned that your focus was social history, and so in this talk you've really focused on the history of the development of photography in Japan. However, I wondered, with that very rich source of information, if you had developed any insights into the social history of that period. I'm assuming your period is sort of around the Meiji Restoration in that area. So anyway, I'd be really fascinated to hear what you had to say about the questions. Thank you.
So the case was actually about the artist not being paid or not being paid enough. I forgot exactly what the case was. And so in the court case, the artist tried very hard to get paid, and the photographer would not pay him what he thought he was worth. That's why Stillfried was asked to become an expert witness. And so he explained, yes, this took 20 days, so he should have been paid for 20 days. I don't actually recall how that court case ended, what he got paid or whether he got paid at all. But it was a court case that was big enough to be covered in the newspapers at the time. So it was in the newspapers several times. Mm-hmm. In terms of insights, gosh, the longer I'm here and the more I research these photographs, the more I realize how little I know and understand. I've been here for 42 years. And those videos, those video clips you see on YouTube sometimes, where you can see how small the Earth is in the universe, where you see a big Earth that becomes smaller and smaller and smaller and becomes a pinprick in the universe, and then it disappears. I feel a little bit like this now after 42 years about Japanese culture. It's like a huge universe that seems to become bigger and bigger and bigger the deeper I go into it. I write about the culture and the customs that you can see in the photographs on Old Photos of Japan, and I also have a free newsletter. So if you go to the site, you can see now, I guess, close to 400 articles. And the newsletter I try to put out about once every week. Sometimes I'm not able to do that because I do a lot of research and I read a lot of books for each and every article. But I've written, for example, about young girls who were hired to take care of the children of middle-class families so that every member of that family was able to work. And because they worked at home, the girls would be kicked out of the house with their wardens, and they would spend all day outside, whether it rained or not. And there's some terrible stories about the kind of lives they lived. So I go into the lives of Japanese people pretty deeply, and I always try in my articles to find quotes of eyewitnesses, of people who were there, if possible, of Japanese people. But very often these things were normal for Japanese people, so they didn't write about them. So I also use a lot of observations by foreign visitors or foreigners who lived in Japan. And I combine it with the maps I use and artwork I have. And in that way, I try to bring old Japan kind of back to life. So please feel free to visit oldphotosjapan.com. Does that answer my question a little bit? Your question a little bit?
Yeah, yeah. Any scholar feels the same way you do about their limitations in their knowledge. The more they know, that's really true. Great answers. Thank you. And I think I checked out your website just cursorily just now, and it's fascinating. So I'll sign up for the newsletter and check out your articles. Thank you.
Just to interject here with a little bit of information, I found a reference in Terry Bennett's Photography in Japan book about the legal case. And in summary, the plaintiff is Felice Beato, who is suing a transport company that had not delivered cases of collodion to him from England. The steamship company. Sorry?
I think that's another case.
Is that another case?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And so the crew of the ship, they thought collodion was way too dangerous, so they threw it overboard on their way to Japan. And Beato was not happy, and it actually made a little caricature. I don't know if you can see it there, right? That appeared in the magazine Japan Punch in 1878.
Okay, that's another case. I think there's probably a citation to this court case in one of the 4 articles that I wrote about the empire of color.
Well, I'll check it out. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't recall right now. Sorry. The older I get, the more forgetful I become.
Right. David Front has a comment here in the chat box, and he says, my questions come from my interest in real photo postcards, which were largely made for sale, but some reflect an awareness, sympathy with American art photography of the time.
Which was, what I was trying to see, if there was some sort of artistic ambition among the photographers who did these wonderful colored photographs, which could exist alongside, photographs which are categorized, if that's the right word, as art.
I think it was for the photographers, like Silvio also just mentioned, that it was an artistic endeavor. Especially Stillfried, I think, considered himself an artist. Tamamura probably considered himself a businessman. I think Inami considered himself an artist, but I think he also considered himself a photojournalist, although that word probably didn't exist at that time. But he photographed like a journalist.
Right.
But yeah, the color, of course, was done by the colorists. And did they consider themselves artists? They were already artists. Yeah. But
they were drawn from the ukiyo-e studios.
Especially from the ukiyo-e, yeah. But also from like the photo I showed of the Japanese woman painting the and the large piece of textile. There were also artists that came from that background that went into coloring photographs. I think for those people, it was just a way to make a living, because they weren't able to make a living anymore as real artists.
Interesting.
I have a question about
studios. In many studios, colorists would actually just do one color and then hand the photo to the next artist who would do the next color. So it's not really art anymore. It's a production line then.
Right, right, right. The Kurt Tyke Company in Chicago had sort of a similar line of artists who dealt with the skies or trees or erasing lampposts or whatever, and they'd pass the card to the next person. So it was a similar economic benefit to have that speed of production.
I've got a question about portrait photography. I know that you often see, even on eBay, the ambrotypes, which are in these bamboo cases. But I've once came across a single photograph because I recognized the name. I bought it. It was a cabinet card of a European kid by Kimbe.
Oh, nice.
I saw Kimbe and I said, "Oh, I know that name." So I just bought it. I'm just wondering, to what degree do you come across things like cabinet cards, carte de visite, etc., in Japan? And
So the portrait photography was actually an important part of their business. And so you do come across portraits once in a while, but these were usually, of course, one-off photographs. Or maybe the customer bought 2 or 3 prints. The tourist photography, now we're talking about hundreds, thousands, maybe tens or hundreds of thousands of the same print. And those you, of course, see a lot, and you come across of them. You come across them everywhere. But I do come across these portraits, these studio portraits. The one that I showed of the Western woman in a kimono, that one was done by the Vasari studio. And once in a while, you see one of these Vasari portraits coming on the market. But these are more personal. So I think it's maybe a little bit more difficult for families to sell them. They probably keep them. And of course, at the time, they probably purchased maybe just 2, 3, or 4 prints, and that was it. So there are not that many of them. They may have photographed many people, but then not that many prints of them. And I don't think it's possible to find out how many they took, because all their accounting records are gone. And that would be the only way to find out.
do they turn up at antique shows and in
Yes.
Japan? The portrait albums, family albums, that kind of thing?
Not so much in Japan, because the people I introduced today, they catered mostly to the foreign market. So, and the best ones show up at foreign auctions and foreign dealers. And another problem in Japan is there are earthquakes, like we just noticed at the beginning of this talk. There used to be lots of fires in Japan. They used to call them the flowers of Tokyo. We have typhoons that cause a lot of destruction, especially in the in the early 1900s to mid 1900s and the late 1800s. And you name a disaster, we have it in Japan, and not once in a while, but all the time. And we got volcanoes that erupt. We got tsunamis. Anything that can happen in terms of natural disasters, we have them all here.
Thanks.
So it's very difficult. And also, it's a very humid climate. I don't know if you've been to Japan. The humidity in summer here is terrible. And so it's very difficult to keep photographs in a good condition in Japan. And another thing that plays a big role in Japan, and this may surprise you, Japanese people don't cherish photographs. They throw them away. So a very common thing that happens in Japan is when somebody dies, and the family members burn all their photographs.
Wow.
So when I ask Japanese friends, like, do you have old photographs, old family photographs? They say, no, we don't have them anymore. I once stood in a store in Tokyo an old bookstore where they sold vintage photographs and vintage postcards. And there were two Japanese ladies standing behind me. And they were really surprised. Wow, these cost so much. And we just threw them all away, they said to each other. And still on the street in my neighborhood, I sometimes find photo albums that are put on the street next to the garbage. They're thrown out. So I have a few.
Sounds like we're gonna do a
albums
field trip
that
to
are
Japan.
on the street. Yeah.
Erwin's raring to go. I can see it. Travel agent.
Yeah. So, and that's, I guess, also the reason why it took so long before there was a really important photography museum in Tokyo, because photographs were just not seen as art. They were not seen as important. It's only changing now. It's just a recent development.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Wow.
Different. It's very different. Yeah.
Space is a big issue in
Keep
Japan.
throwing in questions because I know other people want to talk. But when the burning of photographs, I think of the veneration, if I understand it correctly, of ancestors in
Yeah.
Japan. Has to be an incredibly interesting connection between a predilection for incinerating ancestors as photographs and maintaining a lineage of going back centuries in some cases, the little I know of their ancestors.
And the fact that there's no burials in Japan either. Everybody's cremated by law.
Yeah. In Shintoism, purification is done by water and by fire. And many people used to believe that, and still lots of people in Japan believe that things that you are very close to, for example, a doll, will get its own soul and take some of the negative energy from you. And that's also believed for photographs. So photographs feel alive to some people. And so they feel that when that person in that photograph has died, the right thing to do is to burn that photograph. So it's kind of a purification process for them. That feels very different, I think, to us Westerners. For us, fire is destruction. But here, by many people, it's seen as purification. So old dolls are taken to Shinto shrines. The Shinto priest there will have a little ceremony, and then later the dolls are burned, or in the past they used to be put on small boats and put into the sea. Yeah, because water is also a purification factor. And so that's one of the reasons why so few photographs have survived here, in addition to all the earthquakes and other natural disasters that we have here.
Fascinating. Thank you.
It's a different culture.
Mm.
Yeah.
Actually, today in the news, or yesterday in the news, you know those, I guess in the West, Kentucky Fried Chicken also has Colonel Sanders as a statue in front of the entrance, or is it only in Japan?
We've had them here.
You have them here? Okay.
We've had them here.
I don't remember them.
What we have left are, they're about, little piggy banks.
Okay. In Japan, they're life-sized, and they're in front of
We've had those
Kentucky.
and in the US, yeah.
Okay.
Colonel
In
Sanders.
Japan, they're standing in front of Kentucky Fried Chicken. And in 1985, a Japanese baseball team from Osaka won the series. They became Japan champion. And the Osaka fans were so excited about this that they took one of these statues and they threw it in a canal in Osaka. And ever since, they never won the series again in Osaka. Now, a few years ago, this statue was found again. They found it in the canal. They fished it out. And I think this week or this month, I forgot, but recently, a Shinto priest did a special ceremony for this statue to take that bad spirit away and to make sure that the team can win the series again. And
They've won. They won this year, actually.
Oh, they won.
There you
Okay.
go.
Yeah, yeah.
It
Okay.
worked.
Yeah, it
Oh,
took
so
30
it
worked.
years.
so-
So it lifted the curse of the colonel.
Yes, yeah, the
Yeah.
curse of the colonel. Exactly. That's what they call it here.
And
And they're going to destroy that big doll. It's going to be destroyed. It's going to be burned.
then they'll never win.
Well, the curse is purified, and hopefully they will win it again. You're better informed about the curse of the colonel than I am. Thanks for adding that little information
They-
about them winning it.
They were the current coach was he was forbidding the use of the name victory, so they referred to it as this thing until they won to not to jinx it, and it worked. So
Yeah.
yeah, because they were really
Interesting.
unlucky for like
Yeah.
40 years.
So that gives a little background about like how people feel about and the souls or the bad energy or that is in dolls and in photographs.
Laurent, where are you signing in from?
Osaka.
Ah, of course.
yeah. It's
I had to ask the
Of
question.
course.
Yeah.
Mm.
Welcome.
It's good to see Celio. Haven't seen him
it's
in a long
been what
time.
at least 10 years
Oh,
since I last
more,
saw you.
15
More.
years, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So Lauren, when I was living in Osaka and I had my gallery there, Laurent
you
was
are Laurent.
very
Yeah.
there was a
So
regular
we've been in
visitor.
contact on LinkedIn.
Yes. That's me.
Yes.
I
Okay.
have two
I didn't
accounts.
make
It's a bit
that link.
complicated.
Sorry
No,
about
it's
that.
complicated. I have two LinkedIn accounts. So
Yeah.
this is the other one. Yeah. But you were mentioning about the photographs. It's not as glamorous. Like my wife, anytime she can, like space is a big issue in Japan. So every time she can make space, she they don't burn it. They just throw it in the garbage. And it's like
Yeah.
I'll send you my mailing address. Okay.
I got
No
we
problem.
got a lot. I've been able to salvage some from the family, but they just don't see the value in it, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting, isn't it? It's very different.
Yeah. It's just
But they also
make-
take so
make space
many.
for the
so,
new.
Yeah.
Mm.
And they're all the same though. It's mostly photographs of them showing peace in front of a statue or a Buddha or a temple or Tokyo Tower or so after
KFC.
5 or 10
Mhm.
photographs, you've basically seen them all.
Still.
Wow.
All right.
Any
Well,
other questions?
I
Yeah.
just wanted to say a quick hello to Hal Ottaway joining us from Kansas. I'm glad you could make that connection, and thanks for coming, Hal. And right beside him, Gunter Ott. How are you? Good to see you. Come out to our May event, if you have some bits to sell. It'd be good to see you, mate. Anyway, sorry, Sally, I just had to do a little
no problem. No, so we're
couple
just
of shout-outs.
canvassing for final questions or comments. Again, either through the chat box or here with your microphone and camera. Carol mentions here that you bring omamori back to the shrine to burn.
Yes. And to give a good example of that, for example, at New Year, you go to the shrine to pray for the New Year's. And then very often you buy all kinds of lucky items to bring you luck during the year. Then what you do at the end of the year, on the last few days, you take those items back to the shrine, and there's usually a huge bonfire in front of the shrine where they are thrown into to have them burned. So those items have taken all the negative energy from you, and that is then purified in the fire. So there's kind of a cycle there. You know, January 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, you get these items. And then at the end of the year, you bring them back and they're all burned. And omamori, by the way, is a little item that's supposed to give you luck. It's about this big. And inside, there's supposed to be a sacred thing that will protect you. So many people in Japan have that hanging from the mirror of their car or put it in their bag. I think I have one in my wallet. I just realized
Oh, me too, actually.
in the hope that it will attract some money.
I have one. Wait,
Hasn't worked at all.
I was always
I
thought
used
to keep a 5 yen coin in my wallet to
Oh
attract
yeah,
money.
I have. Look how many 5 yen coins I have in my wallet. I have, let's see,
I don't
I
have
have 5 of them.
And what will a 5 yen coin get you in Tokyo?
Nothing.
Like a quarter of a coffee?
Nothing.
candy.
Yeah,
No.
No, not
yeah, you
even.
cannot buy
No.
anything with a 5 yen coin. I think
Oh,
the
here's mine.
cheapest is probably 50 yen.
Here's mine.
Oh, there's an omamori.
There it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. I did find mine. This is mine. Mm. Do you keep it in your wallet as well, Lauren?
Yeah, my wife forced me to do that.
So you see
Strong
these
with no
foreigners in
comment.
Japan, they have completely Japanized.
Can I add that speaking of Colonel Sanders, that he spent the last 15 or 20 years of his life living in the Toronto suburb of Mississauga. So he certainly started in Kentucky, but became disillusioned and moved to Canada.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Donated a wing. I think there's a wing named after
Chicken
in
wing.
the hospital in Mississauga after him.
Right.
Oh, wow.
That's right.
Must be
Well, if you're
chicken wing.
disillusioned, come over.
I think Hal has a question, but Hal, you have to unmute yourself. Top right.
Sorry.
There you go.
I just wanted to be sure to introduce Shav Levine from San Jose Postcard Club. He's the president there, and he's in my picture. Yeah, there he is waving. Thank
There
you,
you
Shav.
Shab, thanks for coming.
And
Thank
thank you for inviting us. It's just been a wonderful, fabulous evening.
We'll
I
thank.
second that. That was wonderful.
I think we have
Thank you.
our Jerry Donaleko to thank for that.
Our Jerry, you bet.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, we bring those volunteers screaming and kicking onto our executives. So we make them work, making all these connections. That's,
Good deal.
And that's what
Thank
Jerry
you.
does. Thank you, Jerry. And well done. Wow. Good stuff.
All right. Well, I am about to hit the stop button on the record. And then we'll have a few more minutes to discuss anything candidly.